Welcome to The Green Away. I am your guest host, Karren Vergara, a senior journalist at Financial Standard. We are recording on Gadigal land. We pay our respects to traditional custodians of country and elders, past, present and emerging. Joining us on the podcast today, we have Estelle Parker, the Co-Chief Executive Officer at Responsible Investment Association Australasia, otherwise known as RIAA. Estelle, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Karren.
So today we take a closer look at weapons or defence-related holdings. And we ask the question, what does responsible investing mean in the context of conflict? So firstly, how do Australian consumers generally feel about investments in weapons? And what trends are we seeing in terms of demand for greater transparency or divestment in this area?
Sure. Look, people are really interested in these issues and more broadly where their super is invested. There's certainly growing awareness amongst the population of the option to invest responsibly and ethically. And awareness of that option is up to 78%, for Australians from 72% just 2 years ago. And nowadays, 88% of Australians actually expect that their super and banking will be invested responsibly and ethically. In terms of weapons themselves, our research shows that 55% of Australians actually want to avoid investments in armaments. And 48% of Australians say that recent world events have actually prompted them to think about whether or not their investments contribute to human rights abuses. And overall, the overwhelming majority of Australians actually want their fund to commit to environmental and human rights related targets. So we have seen campaigns by super fund members not wanting their retirement savings investing in certain types of weapons or companies. And it's great that our society is having this conversation, but I think it's really important to understand that different people have different ideas of what is ethical when it comes to weapons and the defence industries more broadly. So some believe that investing in weapons is never okay. They want to exclude all weapons from the portfolio, and they believe that financing arms manufacturing means financing warfare. This is a very valid view. There's a number of options in the market that exclude direct investments in all weapons, and weapons-free investing has been around for a really long time. There's another category, civilian firearms, that some may wish to screen out from their portfolios and their investments, and other people might want to exclude only those weapons that cause indiscriminate harm. And they are generally the nuclear weapons or controversial weapons like, cluster bombs, landmines, biological and chemical weapons, and so on. But for these people, investing in the manufacture of weapons that help defend countries like Ukraine, for example, might be okay. So the important thing is that consumers are actually given access to all the information that they need to make their own investment decisions. And funds need to understand in general that they need to provide information to their consumers and potential consumers about what's in and out of portfolios.
So many institutional investors, such as super funds, invest in weapons manufacturers like BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin and Elbit. What risks are associated with investing in these weapons or defence-related holdings?
Look, as I mentioned, consumers are becoming much more aware about where their super and investments are invested. So at the moment, one risk is a reputational risk. There is increased scrutiny by media and by civil society in relation to investments, particularly those that are exposed to potential human rights violations or could be complicit in human rights violations. And often, the reputational risk is not simply the investment itself, but how these weapons are used. There are also some legal risks. Under international law, there are specific treaties that prohibit the development, the production and the sale of certain types of weapons by states. I mentioned controversial weapons before, and a company is actually exposed to legal risks if it's associated with violations of international humanitarian law. And that international humanitarian law, amongst other things, dictates which weapons and military tactics can be used by parties to an armed conflict. And investors should also be aware that under international humanitarian law, just having a business relationship with parties that are found to be violating international law, including humanitarian law, can be an investment risk. So where a company's operations are directly or indirectly supporting or profiting from business relationships with parties to an armed conflict that's then committing violations of international humanitarian law or impacting human rights, that business association can create investment risk for that company. And it's important to note that this is the case for all sectors, not just for weapons and defence industries. So investors do need to have the ability to identify situations in which human rights may be violated by their investee companies or value chains. There is some regulatory risk as well. So in some countries like Switzerland, for example, pension funds and banks are not allowed to invest in equipment that has been specifically designed for military combat. And there's also growing regulatory pressure from in Europe, for example, under the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR, around certain weapons and investment product classifications. So funds need to really be crystal clear, as I said, about what's in and out of portfolios and avoid the risk of greenwashing. As I mentioned, different funds have different attitudes and thresholds. Some options choose to screen out defence industries and civilian firearms altogether. Many funds nowadays choose to screen out investments in nuclear weapons and controversial weapons, in particular due to the indiscriminate nature of the harm they cause. But they need to be really clear about what they mean by this, because there's actually no internationally recognised definition of controversial weapons.
Oh, interesting.
It is interesting. RIAA has one. We've got our certification program definition of controversial weapons, which is anchored in UN conventions and treaties. But if a fund's claiming to screen out controversial or what's sometimes called unconventional weapons, it's really important that they're clear about what they mean by this term so that consumers can make their own decisions.
Estelle, how do materiality thresholds impact decisions about these types of holdings and portfolios? And how can institutional investors ensure that members are able to make informed choices there?
It's a good question. Materiality thresholds certainly do recognise that no business kind of exists in isolation and that global commerce is interconnected. But investors are, if investors are using these kinds of thresholds, they need to be 100% clear about what they are. And this information needs to be accessible to members, to clients, potential consumers, and so on. RIAA does a lot of work around sustainable finance product labelling, and our research is showing that 78% of Australians are concerned about greenwashing in the finance sector. Regulators are cracking down, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
But fully eliminating exposures can at times be complicated. Companies often don't disclose all of their revenue lines. I think greater company disclosure would definitely help in this regard. Mergers and acquisitions are happening all the time. There's a lag in company reporting where you might not be aware of an exposure until after the fact, for example.
Mm.
And many companies are involved in all sorts of activities. And when it comes to the defence industries, a couple come to mind. You've got SAP, the global software company that does supply and earn a small amount of its revenue from the defence industries. You've got many global chip manufacturers that supply renewable energy companies, for example, but they also may derive a tiny amount, like less than 1% often, from something like weapons. And I've heard Julia Lesky from ISS-CSG on a previous episode of this show talking about toilet paper being supplied to a defence force. So, there are questions there about where you draw the line. And so thresholds are sometimes applied, but there does need to be a good reason for them. And they must be, like if you are using materiality thresholds, you must be really consistent with what the fund is telling consumers, and the information about these thresholds need to be readily available. And I would say as well, as I mentioned, companies themselves need to be more transparent. I think we'll see some calls from investors for more transparency for companies and even maybe to segregate military sector activities that are the subject to these exclusions from their other activities.
So what challenges or considerations should institutional investors keep in mind to maintain both ethical standards and financial returns?
Look, there are leading practice standards that can be followed. There are frameworks available. Funds need to be really clear about their exclusions policy in relation to weapons. They need to incorporate relevant international and national legislation. They need to define the scope of their weapons policy very clearly. And they need to understand the risks and exposures associated with their investments. And they certainly should monitor new regulatory developments and monitor controversies as well. And transparency and providing all of this information to consumers is really key. We do know that robust standards can be achieved alongside returns. RIAA certification program, we do have an avoid significant harm criteria that applies a 0% threshold for direct investments in nuclear weapons and controversial weapons. So this is the case for all certified funds that RIAA certifies. And we also do have funds certified that screen out weapons, conventional weapons, in addition to controversial and nuclear weapons, as well as civilian firearms. But during our certification process, we look for all sorts of other things. We make sure that the investment decision-making is consistent and auditable and fit for purpose. We check that ESG considerations are integrated into the process for deciding which companies to invest in. Certified funds need to engage with companies to improve their behaviour. We look at the voting. We require full portfolio holdings disclosure and very high levels of transparency. And we definitely interrogate that the fund label and the marketing material is appropriate for that particular product. And then when you look at the average performance of RIAA certified funds, it does depend on the asset class and time horizons and so on, but returns are generally on a par with or better than the rest of the market. And our recent research shows that overall returns for certified funds are holding very strongly over the medium to short term, with a 13.9% return over 10 years compared to 9.2% for the rest of the market. We also know that from our recent Responsible Investment Benchmark report that performance concerns as a deterrent to responsible investment overall is decreasing. And this is a case for institutional investors, but also for consumers who are becoming less concerned about performance of ethical products at the same time as they're becoming more aware about the option of investing ethically and responsibly.
For institutional investors looking to avoid involvement in armed conflict, what are effective strategies or indicators to identify exposure to weapons in their portfolios, and what type of questions should they ask companies to understand their stance and activities related to conflict?
Look, it's important to remember that there is a difference between investing in weapons or in the defence industries and investing in situations where armed conflict is occurring. Overall, investors are increasingly recognising that adverse human rights impacts pose significant risks to businesses and that they have a responsibility to protect and respect human rights no matter which industry they're invested in. These risks can cause direct earning-related risks to companies. They're certainly amplified in situations of armed conflict where international humanitarian law applies. And the legal risks and reputational risks of being associated with companies that are implicated in human rights abuses within the value chain are increasingly important. So, for example, you may have a telecommunications company that provides intelligence to a party to an armed conflict, or, for example, disrupts the logistics or communications of a party to the armed conflict. And this would actually amount to, under international law, to direct participation in hostilities. And that would result in that company losing civilian immunity under international humanitarian law. So increased focus on this kind of human rights due diligence globally that investors have to keep across is really important. And that's regardless of the sector. Simply being located in a conflict zone actually exposes companies to heightened human rights risks. It's hard to manage this sometimes, depending on the nature of the sector, the company, the conflict, and so on. But identifying exposure to armed conflict either through looking at the geography of where that conflict is occurring, conducting sector-level analysis, looking at the company level, where's the company domiciled, where are its operations, its business relationships, its suppliers, and so on located. And if they're in a conflict zone, you need to do additional human rights due diligence. You could consult civil society organisations. You certainly would look at controversy screening, and then try to prioritise risks in conflict situations. So using a human rights impact assessment is a good way to start to sort of plan, implement, and then monitor in an ongoing way and evaluate those business activities. In terms of the questions that companies should be asked by investors, there are some examples in a conflict toolkit that the RIAA Human Rights Working Group produced and released last year that is really, really useful for investors to have a look at. So it's things like, does the company have an ongoing human rights due diligence process? What kinds of frameworks does it use? Who does it supply to? That's really important. Does the company or any subsidiary have exposure to a potential conflict through its operations or its supply chains? And how is that company enhancing its due diligence to identify and mitigate human rights risks and make sure they're complying with international law? And then, what kind of steps the company's taking to identify parties to a conflict, particularly if those parties have rights violating records. And then looking at the key ongoing human rights risks the company has identified in relation to the conflict. And then, as always, as I mentioned, ongoing monitoring is required. You need to understand how effective those measures have been.
Estelle, that's great. So where can our listeners find out more about RIAA's responsible investing guidance that you mentioned and the Human Rights Working Group?
There's information about our certification program on our website, responsibleinvestment.org, and also on the responsiblereturns.com.au, where we have all of our certified products listed. We also have a lot of information about human rights on our Learn tab of our website. That's responsibleinvestment.org, and then the Learn tab. And in particular, have a look at the conflict toolkit that RIAA's Human Rights Working Group released last year. It's a really fantastic place to start.
Awesome. Estelle, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
It's been really great talking with you, Karren, and it's fantastic that this issue is part of the conversation.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.